All right. Now, if Thomas and I were in the same high school class, he would be considered the more creative student. I would be the more docile student, lacking imagination, because we both received instruction to think aloud or elaborate on the theme of three worlds. And he took the instruction very liberally and ran with it very creatively, whereas I basically stayed at the baseline and thinking hard about three worlds. Now, so I kind of was responding more to an imaginary Thomas that I was anticipating, because as a docile student, I actually handed my homework earlier than the speaker. Now, but one of the things that I took away from him is actually when he talked about body, it's really the theatricality that is at the root of a lot of those artworks. So I want to run with it, and also to engage more closely the three worlds. In other words, my response basically is a second guess imaginary Thomas, and also second guess Johnson. In other words, I was thinking Johnson and the other curatorial team members. Now, I was thinking, like, why the three worlds? In 1993, Johnson had this, I think, a milestone exhibition post 1989. And in that exhibition, I think he basically canonized contemporary Chinese art and lined up the poster boys of the contemporary Chinese art and gave us a very good narrative of how to think about and formulate and tell the story of contemporary Chinese art. Now, that narrative basically was built on a transition story. It was mostly about how 1980s transitioned into 1990s, how the more or less the immediate wake of, in the postmodern era, the modernist 80s transitioned into, after 1989, transitioning into the post. Well, we all know what a post means in that case. But in any case, it's a very neat transition story. And we also know what happened. So recapitulate the situation, put it this way. So 1980s largely is about the thawing in the postmodern era, the liberalization, the striving for the imagined future of modernization. And there's a sense of we are all in this together, and the artists assume the grandstanding role of the enlightening force, leading the unenlightened mass out of the ignorance and leading a charging into the future of modernization. And of course, 1989, everything came to a crushing end, and then China veered unexpectedly on fast track to market economy, and artists also had to deal with commercialism and all that. So Johnson's exhibition really nicely map out this kind of change, how it all evolved from 1980s to the 1990s. And what artists in the 1990s did also was to reflect on what they did in 1980s, and especially on the face of commercialization and the open economy and so on. So they kind of gave up on that heroic striving towards modernity and instead settled for some kind of ironist stance. They both mimic the traditional Maoist legacy, but also try to simulate the brazenness of the nouveau riche, so that the change is obvious. In any case, this is a familiar story. I won't recap there. And so I was thinking, okay, what now? In other words, that story covered 1980s and 1990s very well, but what about the first decade of the 21st century? What is our storyline? I guess it's at this juncture that Johnson started to think, okay, let's try to think about what is the new storyline. And so he came up with this three worlds model. And it's a wonderful model because there are, of course, other ways of slicing the pie. And I would think that the way I would look at is to say that actually I could just do two worlds. One is the traditional and socialist model based on the rural iconography. And then another is, of course, we all know what that is, the commercialism and so forth. But let's stick to the Johnson's three worlds, which I think is still quite enabling analytical model. But I'm more fascinated by the keyword worlds. And when we think about the world, we think of the philosophers talk about possible worlds. And there's a huge amount of philosophical speculation about what is a possible world. I won't recap that heady stuff. It's kind of, head-spinning stuff. But to make it simple, basically philosophers ask this question, like, what is a world? What is a possible world? Basically, they ask what could have been, what may have been, what led to this present world that is a state of affairs. In the meantime, while we are in this particular state of affairs, there could have been many other ways things would turn out to be. In other words, think about think about world basically as one chess move. There's a whole series of moves that led to this present state of that chess position. And then there's also different ways you can get to the future moves. So that's my approach to this three worlds talk. In other words, we can think about all these three worlds not as static conditions or worlds, but more as trajectories. And meantime, there are all these other possible trajectories that could have taken place. So I choose, since I'm an art historian, I'm not a philosopher, so I work with artworks, and I choose three key works to embody three worlds. And you will see that the first one by Han Huang is the traditional world, and the third one is the socialist world, and the second one is the post-socialist world. And there's a good reason to choose these three because they all, they share something in common, which is they all depict ox. So that would make it easier for us to talk about these three worlds. So let's go about talking about these three worlds. And Han Huang, we actually don't know much about why this work was done and what the circumstances. But to use this work as the starting point, you will see that so-called traditional world can evolve in quite surprising ways that you would not imagine possible, but that's what happened. So just quickly recap, go through some of the afterlife of this work. Zhao Mengfu first made very elaborate, witty use of this, and at that time, basically it was Yuan literati's reflection upon what's the problem with China. And he basically resurrected the Tang model to critique the more, what he called the recentist painting, and upholding Han Huang's work as the 古意 versus 近世. So he thinks that, the sort of splash ink of the 13th century is so wrong that we'd better revert back to an early, more archaic model of the Tang aesthetics, in which case Han Huang's painting served that purpose. And then you could see that he painted horse, but he was thinking about this ox. And then he painted the sheep. He was more thinking about Han Huang's ox as well. And you could see that this is actually quite brilliant use. He thinks that there was a lot wrong with this ink wash. And he said, we'd better ran in with some archaic formatting so that things don't get out of hand. But anyway, that's a different story since we're more into the modern contemporary. So let's quickly move to our modern and contemporary period. Now, again, don't ever underestimate this front-facing ox because it's going to play a key role in structuring a lot of the later paintings. And here's one by Ren Yi in 19th century. And you would think that this is more of a seemingly traditional kind of painting. But in fact, it already embodies a lot of the cosmopolitan international Shanghai and the commercialized almost global economy to some extent. So I'm completely in agreement with what Hong Zhaixing talked about. In other words, if I were to look at this painting, you think about actually the connection with the Japanese design, the sense of color, and this weird-looking, monstrous ox that is, designed to appeal to certain taste, and that taste is actually quite cosmopolitan. And just a little aside, so this, in terms of subject matter, it depicts Lao Tzu riding out of the Hanguan, and then the gatekeeper saw Lao Tzu coming, and he kind of had a vision that what came is a circle of purple energy, 一团紫气, and therefore painting like this actually would be very good for wedding gift, a birthday gift, and all that. 紫气东来, has a. And also, but anyway, let's not get into the traditional iconography. But you see how things develop, and we quickly get to the 1980s, and you would think that it is a traditional painting, but it was already internalized the sort of 1980s kind of geometric design. You could see that Lao Tzu become square, and all that. So, so things are not always what they seem. So just as you think that it's more about rural realism or rural traditionalism, it often has other worlds sort of hinting at the possibilities. And in the same year that he painted this painting, he did another painting that actually won the national prize. And you would think that, again, this is a traditional socialist painting because it talks about Helong and the general in the communist base and having a sort of homely, friendly conversation with a peasant. Therefore, it is a typical socialist, realist theme. Again, it's not what it seems to be. In fact, there's a great deal about this flipping of the ox with its rear toward us, and normally you don't do that kind of thing, and to do that is kind of irrelevant. And in the Western cartoon, you will see doing something like this is bad. It illustrates the line, "My child, if sinners entice you, turn your back on them." But it's that sort of thing that actually was gaining official recognition in China, mainly because the surface subject, is acceptable. But in fact, what the artist did was kind of naughty and I would say to some extent even subversive. But no one cares because on the surface, it's about social realist subject. And there's also something interesting about why he was doing it in the 1980s, because that was a time when there's a great deal of irreverence going on. And in part, I think, was inspired by the prevalent talk about Chan Buddhism and all that, the sort of irreverence, Chan Jifeng and all that stuff that was very hot in the 1980s. So the artist kind of worked that into this kind of painting. Again, you could hardly imagine this to be possible in the 1970s, for instance. And it also raises the question about the connection between these two worlds, the traditional world and the socialist world. And the connection is really the kind of rural subject. And we all know that in some ways the ruralism defines Chinese socialism in a way that's radically different from the Soviet socialism. Because according to the orthodox Marx thinking, it is the urban working class that should be the subject of society and change, an agent of change, whereas in China it's always the peasant. And so I would say at the deeper level, it's always the ruralism that matters. And also if we think about in the long terms about Chinese history, it is really the rural that embodies the Chinese transformation or change of foreign things. Like for instance, when Chan Buddhism came, when Buddhism came, Chinese domesticated Buddhism to the extent that it became very rurally based kind of Buddhism. And in Song times, the Chan is essentially a Chinese peasant kind of remaking of Buddhism. And so therefore, initially, when you talk about how to tame your mind and concentrate for effect, the Buddhist use is like you tame elephant, not the ox, but the Song folks would tame the ox to use as a parable for Chan and so forth. But the long and short of it is to say that this rural thinking lies deep in the traditional thinking, but also lies deep in the socialist culture. So, one more thing to say about this painting. Just as you think this is a traditional ink painting, actually the artist used the charcoal method. It's almost like using the charcoal drawing to render the ink painting. So to some extent, it's the ink painting with inflection of charcoal drawing, which is deeply Western in method, in conception. And actually that's one of the popular mode now among a lot of so-called ink painters. To the purists, they're not quite ink painting because they actually basically use the charcoal drawing method to render image. So it look modern, but it's questionable whether that's the sort of traditional ink painting. I'm not making judgment on this, but just to say that this is the sort of thing that gets the whole world talk so more complicated. Now, to Song Ling's Meaningless Choice that was painted in 1986. Again, it seems to be ink painting, but we all know that, and also it seems to be rural in subject, but in fact it's quite cosmopolitan because it already internalized the Andy Warhol aesthetics and this sort of interest in the serial repetition and the rejection of that rural sentimentality and interest in the mechanical reproduction and all that, which was to say that is a sort of a typical 80s kind of striving after a modern future. So nothing is what it seems to be. Now, quite surprisingly, when we get to the present, Yang Fudong did this thing. I don't know whether he had Song Ling in mind, but they both came from Central Academy. The Academy of Fine Arts in Hangzhou, and I think Song Ling was one of his teachers, or at least Song Ling's generation. But just as you think that he is recapitulating the rural subject and getting to the socialism, you could also be wrong because, in fact, this is a guy who actually became the finalist for the Hugo Boss Award, which is to say that his art always embodied that cosmopolitanism that really speaks to the international critics' taste. So he's a darling of the New York taste. And so the fact that he's using this kind of rural subject, actually, at the deeper level, it's quite cosmopolitan, has that sort of polish about it. And in the meantime, there's also a kind of interest in, for him to feel frustrated about the lack of high-mindedness that was typical of the 1980s. So in a way, he was recapture the 1980s stance. And so I think there's a certain kind of link there. And so it's interesting to see this kind of trajectory develop. And then the question is, well, what became of Song Ling's, his own work? And so when we talk about possible worlds, the philosophers typically have their game is like, okay, let's imagine other possible worlds. Let's imagine someone doing things on Mars that is so different from our present world. Well, Song Ling didn't go to Mars, but he went far enough to Australia, and where he did this thing called a qigong, which again, on the surface of it, looks a traditional painting, but we all know it is a sort of painting that came from someone who went abroad, had exposure to the international experience, and looked at China through other mediated lens. And also there's a sense of him recapturing the 1980s kind of aesthetics, which you would think that is, you think about the Chan Buddhism, you think of the Oriental mysticism. These were all international mediated. The 1980s kind of Chan Buddhism is actually mediated through Suzuki. It's not the sort of Chinese Chan Buddhism, it's the Japanese inflected Chan Buddhism. That was sort of 80s thing. And when you think about the Oriental mysticism, it's not the Chinese-born kind of Orientalism. It's more about the Western, like physics of Tao and that kind of work. It was through that kind of lens that 80s had this kind of mystic looking work. And so I think he's recapitulating that 1980s kind of work. And also, well, you would think, of course, the Pong Society of, for which he was a member. But people often forget, in fact, one of the key works that was behind, that was the source of intellectual inspiration, was actually a Polish theorist named Jerzy Grotowski, who had a book Toward the Poor Theater. So that book, the Polish theorist's work, was actually the Bible of the Pong Society, including Song Ling. So when you think about all this, it becomes very messy because to some extent, it's the Polish source that is part of the international scene. So do you think that a socialist world or the post-socialist world? It gets messy, but we get the picture. So back to our drawing table. And the third work, again, looks like social realist work, but already had 1990s kind of inflection. And it internalized the sort of 1980s geometric formation, and it explores the issue, the figure ground in a very interesting way. And well, I'll skip this but for the time's sake, just to say that, in fact, while Gong worked on this painting, he had a very interesting sidekick, and who produced very interesting work. But you know his training phase was in this painting. In other words, when he worked on this, a lot of impulses already point to anticipate a future development. And that future trajectory is quite surprising and unexpected. And let me show you how. So one of the formal impulse that played out is that to treat this more as a theater design, with there's a sort of foreground, then there's a big backdrop, and how to place the figure, the foreground figure against the, the figure-ground relationship become a formal issue that artists work with. And with that, the artist can go a long way. And we all know, so that is work that he did, Wang Xingwei's work. And it basically involved flipping the figure around, but still working with the figure-ground operation. And in the same way, we could see that it basically worked in the same way. And here's more interesting work. And this is work, I think, that tells us that the artists now in China really are completely in sync with the international world in terms of the art trend and so forth. And Wang Xingwei is known as someone who produced a lot of conceptual art. And this is, I think, it's a brilliant, brilliant conceptual painting. So what it does is that it asks you to think about the sailor as someone associated with the ocean, and think about the flight attendant associated with the air. And once you think about these, then the three bands now become spatial recession. In other words, if you take away these two figures, these are just three bands without any spatial recession whatsoever. It's just three flat surfaces, right? But once you put these two figures there, and especially with the cue that think about ocean, think about the air, then you think, oh, there's a spatial property there. So what it does is that it does many things, of course, but it is a wonderful conceptual artwork in the sense that it shows you that, you can be easily fooled, and also to show that, in fact, the abstraction, what we call abstract painting, it just takes a little for him to tweak with the figuration. Then you can get the sort of completely look at the painting completely differently. In any case, I think but all this came from, I think, came from him early phase of working with this kind of figure ground that you would think that is social realism, but that actually sowed the seed for the conceptual painting later on. Now, I don't have time to go through other works, but just want to end with two sets of paintings to show you how this kind of paradigm or formal model can generate a kind of trajectory that often take you to unexpected places. For instance, with that, you can go a long way with this flipping of the ox. And now think about this. And the same northeastern painters could also see that flat surface of the corn pile and conceive it more as a set of a pile of geometric shapes with this roundedness that can get you to a different sort of formal conception, which of course leads us to our tradition. Okay, thank you very much.